After realizing that strategic fights were not the norm or the standard in the battle genre, I started thinking about them more and noticed simple patterns that make creating a good fight so easy. There are two types of strategies and two types of fights. There are two main types of strategies that work very well: weak spot and adaptation. Weak spot is when a character finds a weakness in their opponent's strategy, fighting style, or magic. This is useful when a magicless hero is fighting a magical threat. Adaptation is when a character modifies their approach or uses their abilities in unconventional ways to counterbalance their opponent's advantage. This is useful when you want to highlight a character's versatility and intelligence with their magic or fighting style. Then there are two simple types of fights. The first is make a strategy. Having the hero make a strategy works best when the opponent is stronger than the hero, but it also works in evenly matched fights. The hero has to come up with a strategy that can beat the opponent. Oftentimes, the opponent's advantage doesn't come from thinking or strategizing. That's just the way they fight. The hero has to do the thinking to win. The strategy can be physical or magical. It could be finding a weak spot in the opponent's fighting style or magic, or it can be the hero using their own abilities to adapt. In Everyone vs. Pride, the opponent's shadow powers are too strong. The heroes have to turn off the lights, rely on sense of smell, and use flashbangs. Ed specifically copies Greed's technique to block the sharp shadows. The fight is won by trapping Pride in a dome with no light, so no shadows. This uses weak spots and adaptation. In Sasuke vs. Jotaro, the opponent's bombs are dangerous, so Sasuke has to use his elemental advantage to defuse them. Jotaro has a weak spot, but is only available to Sasuke due to his creative use of his own powers. In Everyone vs. Jubito, the opponent's sage powers make him invulnerable to everything except Senjutsu and Taijutsu, so the heroes have to hit him with Senjutsu combo attacks and surprise attacks. Sage Obito has a weak spot, but the heroes also use their unique powers creatively to adapt. Luffy vs. Crocodile is a simple example. Croc's sand prevented him from being damaged, so Luffy adapted by using water and blood to hit him, which was also a weak spot. In Zoro vs. Mr. One, One's steel body prevented Zoro from cutting him, so Zoro had to learn how to cut steel. This is an adaptation. In Kenshin vs. Aoshi, the opponent's short sword gives him a speed advantage. Kenshin adapts by holding the base of his sword to make his katana the same length. In Jojo vs. Dio, Dio's time stop is greater, so Jojo has to use multiple strategies to land hits, like the magnet trick or playing dead. This uses adaptation. The other type of fight is break a strategy. Having the hero break the opponent's strategy works best when the hero is stronger than the opponent, but it also works in evenly matched fights. When the opponent is weaker, they often start by adapting to the hero's strengths. Having the opponent use a confusing ability is a good way to keep them in the fight while being weaker. Here, the opponent is usually strategizing to win because they know they need the advantage. To win, the hero has to break this strategy, either by finding a weak spot or adapting. In Sanji vs. Mr. Two, Two took advantage of Sanji's inability to hit women by turning into them. Sanji found a weak spot, which is that Mr. Two has to turn back right before attacking, and he later adapted by tricking Two into touching his face. In Sasuke vs. Danzo, Sasuke had more raw power, so Danzo adapted with his confusing Izanagi ability. Sasuke won by finding a weak spot in his stock count and creatively tricked him into thinking he still had one left after draining all of his stocks. In Ed vs. Greed, Ed was the superior combatant, so Greed gave himself the advantage by using his full body armor. Ed adapted by changing the chemical makeup of the ultimate shield to weaken it, allowing his attacks to work. In Kenshin vs. Hanya, the opponent's striped arms created an illusion that confused the hero. Kenshin found a weak spot by measuring the arms with his own katana, breaking the illusion. After being defeated by Josuke easily, Angelo adapted by turning his water stand into vapor. Josuke adapted by luring the sand into his body and sealing it like in the first battle. In Josuke vs. Kira, Kira uses explosive bubbles to attack Josuke from a distance. Josuke adapts with his multi-step glass bullet plan. In Jotaro vs. Yellow Temperance, the opponent had a stand that could nullify Star Platinum's speed and strength, so Jotaro used a universal weak spot. Defeating the user defeats the stand. He drowned him in the water with his own stand, forcing him to open up the stand's guard to breathe, giving Jotaro an opening to end the fight. In Polnareff vs. Ebony Devil, the opponent adapted to the power gap by tying the hero under the bed and beating up his stand, who couldn't see because the user was under the bed. Polnareff adapted by breaking glass and using the reflection to find his opponent, allowing him to stab him. The types of strategies are more important than the types of fights because there's a lot of overlap between making and breaking a strategy. I actually struggled to firmly place some of these fights. The types of fights are more focused on the feeling of who, between the hero and the opponent, is naturally stronger. The fighter that has to adapt first is usually framed as the weaker one. Here's an example of overlap. Sasuke vs Deidara and Ed vs Greed both have an opponent with a weakness that is discovered and exposed by the hero. The reason they're in different categories is because Ed was superior to Greed, who was being carried by his armor. Meanwhile, Deidara wasn't using his bombs to make up for a power gap. One strategy felt like compensation, the other felt like a natural advantage. Using certain pairs can frame the character's strength differently. For example, Hanya vs Aoshi. Hanya is weaker than Kenshin, but Aoshi is on the same level as Kenshin. Hanya is given a weak spot plus break a strategy fight. The type of fight makes him the weaker combatant, and the type of strategy he's beaten by makes his technique imperfect and flawed. Aoshi is given an adaptation plus make a strategy fight. The type of fight makes Aoshi the naturally superior combatant, while the type of strategy he's beaten by means he had no weak spots and forced the hero to think outside of the box to win. Ultimately, fitting fights in one type over another isn't important. The types are just an optional way of thinking of the fights. Even strategies can overlap between adaptation and weak spots. If you're trying to write a simple tactical fight, you can pick one strategy type and pick one fight type. Doing that bare minimum will make the fight's writing decent. Some of these fights have multiple strategies. Technically, I only talked about macro strategies. You can throw in micro strategies and have both fighters adapting and exposing weak spots multiple times to increase the complexity. In conclusion, the two common types of strategies are weak spot and adaptation, and the two common types of fights are make a strategy and break a strategy. Keep reading, you Barians.